My name is David Brown. I have a blog called The Trendy Troodon as well as this channel. I haven't done a video in a while and I've been thinking about doing a few things a bit different. And for this video, I will be talking about Star Wars ships and specifically whether there are any Star Wars ships that are realistic, as in that they would work and make sense as something you would really use in outer space. And this gets argued a lot, and the thing that gets brought up a lot is that Star Wars is not hard science fiction, but more like what would be called science fantasy. Now we think of that as a fantasy science fiction hybrid, but it was really its own thing a long time back, especially with things like Flash Gordon, which we actually know is what George Lucas originally wanted to make instead of Star Wars. And I have tried recording this video before doing this. For this, I have mainly adjusted lighting. I have these blinds behind me so I can get my camera on a more solid surface and just to have better lighting. So the other thing is just that I'm going to try to be a little more organized and really get into this fast. So the first thing I will say is that for Star Wars ships designs, I would see three categories for good ships. The first level would be not that bad. And I would apply this especially to the ships that are already getting criticized. The way I would define it is that it has some elements of functionality. There's some things that would make sense on a real spaceship, and few, if any, things that would actually get in the way of an actual spaceship, especially that would not fit the function it's supposed to have on screen. The next level is mostly good, and again, what you're really looking at is functionality, especially in universe. It doesn't necessarily have to be something that would work in the real space, especially if you were involving things like hyperdrive, artificial gravity that are assumed in the Star Wars universe. But everything fits the function that the ship is supposed to do and what we see it doing on the screen. And then there's a level I would say is actually okay, where it would make sense as a real spaceship and it could actually work, again, at least assuming any technology that's simply science fiction or science fantasy. So what I'm going to start with are the TIE fighters. Now, I'll be using real collectibles for this, but I'm going to try to deal with only ships that are in the movies, not really going into things like expanded universe or the sequel or prequel trilogies. And this is a very interesting little line they did. Around 2015 or 2016, Hot Wheels released a series of toys that were based on concept models created by a guy named Colin Cantrell. He passed away relatively recently, and this shows really a lot about how the Star Wars aesthetic evolved. So with the TIE Fighter, it gets criticized a lot, and part of that really is that they were increasingly shown not working. Like you went from the original movie where they actually almost wipe out the rebels, to video games where you would see one X-Wing wiping out whole squadrons. And there are things that are easy to pinpoint as not making sense even in universe, but there are two things that are good and that I would say put the original design at least in not that bad territory. The first thing is that it's a modular design, and that in itself gives some functionality in universe. You could take the ball cockpit, you could take the wings and mix and match them, which they did develop over time. Especially they developed the TIE Fighter into the TIE Interceptor, which at least has more weapons. And you had things like Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, that outside the canon they made more like the Rebel fighters, so it's supposed to have things like deflector shields and faster than light drives. And the other thing is simply that this does not simply look like an airplane. It's not like an X-Wing where they took an airplane design and tried to come up with a way for it to go into space. If anything, it looks like something that would specifically not work in an atmosphere, which is really the most realistic parameter for anything besides a shuttle or a landing craft. And something I think has also been missed in the original trilogy, that's actually what we see the TIE fighters doing. They, in the first Star Wars, only are ever seen in space. In Return of the Jedi, even, you only see them in space. The one time we do see them in an atmosphere is at the very end of Empire Strikes Back, when we see them chasing the Millennium Falcon around Cloud City. We know there's something like an Earth-like atmosphere because Luke is hanging from the bottom of the city and still able to breathe, but we still have some unknowns. It could be more like what the Earth atmosphere would be at the top of Mount Everest, or even higher at 20,000 or 50,000 feet. So that's a reasonable exception to the rule for how this works. Now, what does get talked about is that they have just the window to look out, but then they have the wings on either side that could deflect or obstruct vision. That's actually partly dealt with in a TIE Interceptor. It might have a little better field of view, but what they really show also is that the pilots are using a lot of instruments. And that is the most realistic picture of what operating a spaceship would be like. You would not just be eyeballing it, you would be looking at your sensors for things that would probably most of the time be too far away to see. And I think if there would be any change to make here, it would simply be make the entire ball cockpit out of glass, so it would look more like a ball turret on a World War II bomber. And what you might go so as far as to do is take the engines and the wings, put them behind the ball so you can make it a wraparound, all-transparent cockpit, which was kind of what they showed with the TIE Defender. So overall, rating these the way I've talked about, this, like I was saying, you can consider not that bad. Darth Vader's TIE Fighter, I would put in the level of mostly good. And the TIE Bomber, I would go so far as to say is mostly or actually okay. And this is where you see the concepts taken as far as they can go. You have something that's very modular. In the lore, this part here could carry bombs or troops if it's used as a shuttle. And it could even do other things like carrying cargo, or if you were going the other way, you could put something extreme like a really heavy laser cannon in here. It's not shown, but you can picture it. And with this cockpit, it's still functional. If there's anything you could argue about, it's why the cockpit needs to be this long, but the flip side to that is you don't necessarily know what's in there. It might be more cargo, it might be more fuel, it might be an additional pilot. And again, it's modular, so they could have any or all of those things on different models and individual ships. And another thing that is worth talking about is the Y-wing. And this, I would say, is the best of the Rebel fighters in terms of functionality. And the first thing there is it has a pretty distinct function. It's supposed to be a cross between a fighter and a bomber, and that is something that has precedent. You have the Stuka, and you also have the P-61 that they called the Black Widow. The P-61 especially, it was designed as a large fighter, but they still had bomber features, so it could have a bomb load, and it had a turret. And I will say something about this actual model or toy. This is from the Kenner diecast line, and all the collectors will know that ended pretty early. They came out with their own TIE bomber that was only given limited release, so it's now really valuable. This would have been earlier than that, either coinciding with the original movies marketing, or maybe into when they were starting to make Empire toys, and it is a good representation of what you see on screen. So you can see all the features I was talking about. You have the turret, you have the nacelles. One of these I have read was intended to come off as a battle damage feature. And something else you can see is that you also have a highly modular design that you could probably adapt a bunch of different ways, especially back here. We don't necessarily know all the details, how much of this is the engines and equipment and how much is bombs or other storage areas, but that's overall in its favor. You could picture it being used to actually transport people or cargo, and you've got the cockpit up front, so you could probably swap that out or especially modify the turret for different things. And what you can argue about is these rails here. In the movies, they show it with these rudders at the back, which really just would not work. Here, in manufacturing the model, took some liberties that actually make it make a bit more sense. Especially you don't have anything in the way of the rocket thrust, so you wouldn't have either obstruction of the thrust or overheating components of the ship. Where you could really make this work is if you assume that these things are something like electromagnetic rails that could further accelerate the thrust. It really probably wouldn't work much better than just having the nozzle right at the back, but it's an idea that could work. Overall, if you were going to change anything, it would simply be to make the nacelle all solid, either make it shorter or fill out the back part. So overall, I would say this is mostly good. And another design that's worth a lot more discussion is the blockade runner. Now, this is where you have a little bit of lore. The model for the blockade runner was not supposed to be the blockade runner. It was designed to be the Millennium Falcon. This is another one from the line based on Colin Cantrell's designs. And I'll say something about this. This is also from the Action Fleet line. Now, I will say about the Action Fleet that these I would consider the best Star Wars ship line ever released that you can consider both collectibles and toys. Though this is not quite the best, some of the proportions are wonky, especially the engines back here are actually a little bit bigger and blockier than proportions. And up front, they really couldn't keep the scale that it actually has on the screen, though it would probably be pretty close to the scale it would have had if it had become the Millennium Falcon. And here's the Colin Cantrell design again, and you can really see how well they line up with each other. So this I would consider one of the very best, if not the best, Star Wars ships in terms of realism. And what you really see is that going from this to the Millennium Falcon changed the aesthetic of the movie and then the series. With this, it's modular and it's very functional. You can make out all the parts of the ship. You can assign functions to all of the things you can see. So you've got the cockpit, you've got the middle fuselage that you could use for cargo, troops, or whatever else you needed. You've got the guns, and you've got the deflector dishes, or rather the sensor dishes. And right at the back, you just have these completely massive engines. And there is some further lore about why this was changed. The story George Lucas gave was that he was concerned that it looked too much like a ship that was in a TV series called Space 1999. What I personally suspect is that it was a more general decision. Up to when they were designing this, they were staying not too far from realistic ships, so they made it look like things like the Discovery in 2001, but then with the Millennium Falcon, they changed it into more like space fantasy ships. So I would definitely rate this actually okay, particularly in this form. Even resized and modified as it appears on screen, it makes sense. And one more thing that fits is that this looks very good. They ended up with a model that was way more detailed than it needed to be, which, if you read the accounts, annoyed a lot of people who were working for George Lucas, but that really made it a lot more memorable when it does appear. And what you'll notice is that if you're really looking for it, it appears in all the movies. If anything, it gets its most prominent appearance in appearances in Return of the Jedi. And I'm just going to give a few more views of it here. Yes. So overall, it's a very functional ship, and it's a very appealing ship. And I will have to say, this would definitely have worked a lot better than the final Millennium Falcon design if they had used it. So that covers the most interesting ship, and I do have several more I plan to cover. Two of them I'm ready to cover together. These are the Return of the Jedi Rebel fighters. There's the A-Wing, the B-Wing. They might look like either Hot Wheels or Micro Machines. They were something different from 2015. I really would have to look up things to say who made them, and they did do a good job here representing what's shown in the movies. You have the B-Wing with the movable wings, and you've got the cockpit that can turn, and it can fly upright. With the A-Wing, it can move the cannons, and for no particular reason, you can raise the cockpit. So with the A-Wing, I would rate this mostly good. It's a little debatable how well it would work. The real issue is just that if it was moving fast for a spaceship, you would be past what human reflexes could handle. That's really a problem across the series, so you can really just wave that off as a convention for the assumed universe, and everything about it would be functional. It's really a very simple design. Its shape has some aerodynamic properties, so if it was at least dipping into an atmosphere, it might actually generate lift, or at least not generate too much drag. And you can really see that the emphasis is on making it fast. You've got just the cannons for the weapons, you've got this little cockpit, and in the back you've got these really big engines. And that really is pretty close to how the Blockade Runner was designed, focusing on the engines. With the B-Wing, I would rate it actually okay, and there's a few things that really work. One thing is that it doesn't have a specific up or down. It can fly sideways, it can fly vertical. It's still a little more like an aircraft than a real spaceship would need to be, or that would help a real spaceship, but it's still at least flexible. It's again got a modular design, so you have weapons you could probably modify. And with the cockpit, because it can swivel, you could keep the pilot upright. And again, if you would change anything, as with the TIE Fighter, it would be to actually make it with more visibility, even make the front part of the cockpit module all glass. So those are the Rebel ships, and where you're really getting into the debatable territory is going to be with the Star Destroyers and the other big ships, really both for the Rebels and the Empire. So what I'm choosing to represent the Empire is the Executor, or Super Star Destroyer. Now this is a model from Bandai that's been on the market within the last 4 or 5 years. If they aren't still making it, you could probably still find it for a good price. And it's an all-snap model. I didn't paint it just because that's not what I do. So with this, you can easily object to it just by the size. There was different lore about that. People were trying to give a size of 5 miles, but when the people who built the model and came up with the designs were talking, they said, no, this is 12 miles. And based on that, it's obvious that this is not practical, but that's addressed in universe. It's It's the Empire. They're about power and overwhelming force, and that's what this would be. They would, if anything, be saying, we don't care if it's practical or not, we're still going to build this thing. And as it's shown in the movies, it actually is very effective. So there's a few things that are good here. The major thing is just that all the parts can still be assigned a function, at least no less so than the regular Star Destroyers, and there's nothing that simply doesn't make sense. You've got the engines, you've got the bridge, presumably you've got a bunch of weapons here. If you were tweaking this, it would really be to have some weapon that was big enough to see, especially right here at the front. You could go so far as to take a part of the Death Star super laser and put it in here, which they did do with the really big ships in the expanded universe. Here, they didn't show that, but it might still not be ruled out. And what I think is really good about this is that they have this huge hangar bay. It's almost too big, but you can say the same thing about the ship. And the upside of that, though, you can say it's not obvious why you would have a hangar this big, but then that would open up a lot of things that aren't obvious. If there was a disabled regular Star Destroyer, they could just pull the thing into the hangar bay. If there was a rebel ship they were conquering, or capturing rather, they could pull it in, even if it was a big cruiser. Even if the war was over, you could use this thing for asteroid mining. Just blow up the asteroid, if you could pull in the whole thing, and pull the chunks into the bay to take them apart. So overall, I would say this is mostly good. The original Star Destroyer I might make still not that bad. And one more thing that's interesting with this, they actually did show the issues with the bridge. At the end of Return of the Jedi, of course, the bridge is destroyed and the ship crashes. So in universe, it's debatable whether the bridge should be here at all. But they do show where there's the upside, both with this and the regular Star Destroyers. You see the Imperial crew actually able to look out to see the situation, and it also shows that they aren't simply hiding from any threat. And that would be just a valuable mentality for the military. And of course, you can argue how good the Imperials are for a military, but the bridge shows where they have a real philosophy. And to go with this, and I'm going to figure on this being the last one I cover, are the Mon Calamari cruisers. These we only see in Return of the Jedi, and these are some of the best ships. I've got two here. This is a version of Home 1 that Hot Wheels released in the last few years. And this is something very unique. It's a bootleg version of a Star Wars ship from the very end of the 1990s. And one of the things you can see here is that at the time the movies were in theaters, there just wasn't a market for it. Kenner made a diecast version of the Star Destroyer. You had models of some of the big ships, but for the toy line, people just weren't interested in something that wasn't a fighter, or at least something like the Millennium Falcon that you could put figures in. From the 90s onward, you were getting people who were showing the big ships in Micro Machines, and a little later you saw other people moving in with things like the collector fleet. And this in particular then came from the very late 90s. It was a line of friction toys that were called Star Force. I can remember seeing these in the shelves. I always regretted not buying them, and this was from a lot I just acquired of them. So with these, I would at least rate them mostly good. And here are the things that work. The first thing is that it's a very different aesthetic from the Empire. With the Star Destroyers, there's a whole lot of angles and flat surfaces. Here, it's contoured and organic, so it really makes it look like something that was made by an alien species or certainly a different culture. And it's also really a little more functional. There's not necessarily well-defined functions to all the things, but there's nothing that wouldn't make sense. You can see the engines at the back. You can see these little pods or blisters, and they could really do a lot of different things, which makes it a modular, but also, again, an organic design. So you could put lasers in there, you could put shields, you could even make these smaller craft that could detach. We don't see that, but again, it's not necessarily ruled out. And you also would see where they are making some use of all sides of the ship. And here especially you have the hangars in the side. Now, one thing that's a bit of a rabbit trail here, with this ship, there's no canonic size. The ones like this are implied to be the size of the regular Star Destroyers, so about a mile long. And that says something there that for Star Wars, a mile long is their more minimum size. But I would picture this being much bigger, at least close to the alternate size given for Executor, 4 or 5 miles. My headcanon would be these ships actually being the same size. The way it's shown on screen, it might not be that extreme for how big this is, but it's not necessarily ruled out. And here's the bootleg again. And again, you can see it's not necessarily practical, even by Star Wars standards, but everything you see makes sense, and they really are some of the most attractive Star Wars ships. And that, I think, really gets to where the movie succeeded. They made ships that were functional, at least in universe, but still look good. And I think that is where you can also see a contrast between Star Wars and the Alien franchise. With the Nostromo, it was a big ship that looked kind of cool, but it did not make the same impression. It wasn't that memorable, even to the people who liked the movies. But that was obviously not the case with the Star Wars ships. And with the Nostromo, that's where you can really see the other end from the good Star Wars ships. There's parts of it that make sense. I actually have part of the bootleg line that is alien ships, but I'm going to do that separately. So it looks kind of cool on screen. You can see parts that make sense, but mostly it's just a big collection of stuff with no definite function. And with Star Wars, there's really very, very few ships that get to that level. And that also made the ship a lot more marketable, and that's where things got a lot better from the 1990s onward. We were no longer just dealing with kids who wanted action figure accessories. You had both kids and teenage and adult collectors who really wanted to have all the Star Wars ships. And things maybe kind of peaked around the 1990s, but you still get very good ships like this one, and especially the Executor model here. So we really are seeing how much Star Wars has endured. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. And this version I am going to go ahead and post. And I will definitely do more on this. I think especially the bootleg line. For now, I'm signing off.